Hi, I'm Ted Pattison from Critical Path Training. Very excited to be part of this IT Unity event this week. That's me in the picture. Ignore the loudmouth Texan and the cowboy hat because it's me. I'm the one who's holding your ticket to success here by teaching you how to use the Office 365 Unified API. What's the agenda for today's session, you might ask? Well, we'll start with an introduction to the Unified API in Office 365. What is it? Where did it come from? And why do you want to use it? We'll then talk about working with MVC5 web applications. And when you're programming against the Unified API, you have to manage the authentication process and cache access tokens. So we'll talk about how to do that. And then we'll finish with an exploration of programming with the Unified API client library. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the introduction to the Unified APIs. Well, first of all, we've seen that Microsoft last fall released the Office 365 APIs. The idea was to create a platform that's inclusive of all developers, no matter what development platform they're using, Windows, iPhone, Android, and to achieve that, to basically base the programming model on standards-based web services using OData, using OAuth 2.0, and using the OpenID Connect protocol. Now, the picture that you see represents the original offering in the Office 365 APIs. So if you wanted to program and get information about the current user, you'd program against the Graph API served up by Windows Azure. There's also other APIs or other service endpoints that were initially offered with the Office 365 APIs. One that was Exchange-based to basically get at mail messages, events, and contacts, and another that was SharePoint-based to get at files in a SharePoint document library, either in a OneDrive for Business site or in a SharePoint site. Now, one issue that we had with the first generation of the Office 365 APIs is that you had to go to different services and access different endpoints and manage different access tokens per user for each service that you wanted to go to. So it would be reasonable to want to create an application that gets information about the current user. We have to basically query into Azure AD, and then to get information about mail messages or to send mail for the current users. So you have to access a second service through a second service endpoint in a different access token for something like the Outlook service. And then when you wanted to access SharePoint data, you had to go to a third and possibly a fourth service and basically get an access token for a different resource. So just as an example, here's the code that we used to write. And the idea would be, let's say that you want to do something like program against the calendar. So the first thing that we have to do is program against the discovery service. So let's go ahead and call into the cloud to get an access token for the discovery service. So then I could make a call into the discovery service and say, show me the service endpoint for something like the calendar. And then that would give me back the service entry point to the Outlook service. And then you'd have to basically get another access token for that. So it's just a whole bunch of work. So the big benefit of the Office 365 Unified API is you have a single endpoint, a single service that abstracts away these divisions between Azure Active Directory, Outlook, and SharePoint data. So the idea is one web service, one resource served up at https://graph.windows.net. That is what we call the Office 365 Unified API, which some people refer to as the Office Graph or the Office Graph API. And the idea is that a single API and a single access token buys you access to data that spans Azure, Outlook, and SharePoint. Now, let's go ahead and kick the tires. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this sample application that Microsoft has put up on the internet for us at https://graphexplorer2.azurewebsites.net. So let's go ahead, and once you get to this particular endpoint, it's going to ask you to sign in. Now, I'm not going to sign in as Ted Pattison. I'm going to sign in as Katie Jordan, or think of it as Caitlin Jordan if you'd like. Let's go ahead and sign in right here. And so what I want to show you is that you can go ahead and basically just put the URLs in place. So if I want to get information about the current user, it's just graph.microsoft.com/beta, and realize that once it goes into a release. It will probably be v1.0/me. Let's go ahead and do a get right here, and you can basically see the data coming back inside there. Okay, well, let's say that I want to get a little bit more information. Maybe I want to get information about the current tenant inside of Active Directory. So /beta, my organization, /tenant details. Let's go ahead and do a get operation on that. Hey, well, that's pretty neat. Let's get some other information from Active Directory. Let's get information about the current users. You can see that this is all pretty easy, pretty straight ahead. Maybe I want to get information about the Active Directory groups. So what you can see is that this allows me to get at your general Active Directory data. Well, let's say now I want to move over to Outlook. So here's an example of graph.microsoft.com/beta/me/messages. Note that when you query for messages, you have to put in some filter information so you don't ask for every single message in a mailbox that has 3 years worth of data inside of it. But now you can see that I'm getting messages back inside here. And the final thing that I want to do is basically show that using this API, we can also access files from that particular user's OneDrive for Business site inside there from their main files document library. Okay, so what we've seen right here is it's fairly easy to get up to speed and get in and begin using things that are part of this API. Okay, well, let's keep moving. So the next thing that we want to do is talk about creating a Azure AD application. So every time that you want to work with the Office 365 APIs, whether it's the unified API that we're just talking about today or some of the other ones, you have to create an application and register it with Azure Active Directory. And the idea is once you have created this inside there, you're either going to create a native client application or a web application or a web service. So here's an example where I create a native client application. I give it a name. I give it a client ID. The client ID is going to be very important because that is the GUID that we use to identify who we are when we're talking to Azure. So the client ID becomes basically the name of your application. Now, another thing that we have to do is we have to configure permissions. Now, this is a little bit of a pain because for the last couple months in Visual Studio, you've been able to use the Connected Service Wizard, and the Connected Service Wizard will allow you to create a project in Visual Studio and automatically register it with Active Directory within your tenancy, and then to basically set permissions for Azure and for Outlook and for SharePoint. The problem is today, we're talking June of 2015, Visual Studio has not been updated, or at least the Office tools. That should be updated hopefully soon, but currently you have to go into the Azure portal and manually configure the permissions. So here's an example of what permissions that we have. And it spans basically from dealing with user and group information in Azure for your current directory to dealing with Outlook data like messages and calendar events, all the way down to files and SharePoint data. Okay, now what I want to do here is show you how to create a quick starter application. The idea is within about 5 minutes, you can go to Visual Studio, you can create a console application, and you can basically just start programming directly against your Office 365 tenancy. Okay, now one of the things that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to add some NuGet packages. Also, you're going to have to create the native client application inside of Azure Active Directory, and then you're going to have to basically copy things like the client ID into the code. But then what we can do is we can program against the unified APIs by using the .NET Client Library and this thing which is called the GraphService proxy. Now, what you're going to see is that there are two essential NuGet packages that you have to add in. One is the Active Directory Authentication Library, And so when you're writing .NET code, this allows you to create things like the authentication context, which then has methods that abstract away you having to create the URLs and manage the interaction of having the user sign in. And then also, we're going to use the Office 365 Unified API Client Library as well. So all we got to do is create a console application and add those two different packages inside there. Now, we're going to have to add a set of application constants as well. So here are things that we're going to need. We need somehow to identify our tenant. So in our demo, I have a couple different test tenants I'm working with, things like CPT Classroom 1, CPT Classroom 2, and I have gone and I've registered these as an application inside those tenancies. And then basically I get the client ID, which was created by Azure, added inside there. Now, if I look down below here, one thing that I want to point out is a very specific set of URLs that you're going to need. So one, which is just graph.microsoft.com, is a resource ID that we're going to need when we want to get things like an access token or authorization code. There is the root Office Graph API entry point /beta, and then there's also the URL host tenancy inside. Now, another thing that we have to think about as we're doing this is working with access tokens. So here's an example where I have this function, private static task string, that's the return type, acquire token for user. Now, in this simple example, what we're going to do is we're going to acquire an access token, and then we're going to store it off in a static field, which is just called access token inside there. So this code basically says get the access token if the access token variable is null. But once we've gotten the access token, this function will just basically require the access token that we're caching. So this is a very simple caching scheme, but what I'm trying to get into your head is this idea that caching access tokens is very important because you don't want to have to reach across the network to get an access token if you're going to do that 10 times inside a single request. We want to cache access tokens definitely for a single request, but also across requests because they're expensive to obtain. Okay, so here I am in the Azure Management Portal. So under Active Directory, I can see the different directories. Here's this one test directory that I'm going to use. So I'm going to go to where it says Applications. Now under Applications, I see the application my company uses, application my company owns, so I can see the different applications that I have right here. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add. I go ahead and click Add, and I say add an application my organization is developing, and I want a native client application, and I'll just call this TED's Unified Console App. Doesn't really matter what I call this right here. After I have created that, what is my redirect URI? Now, this is going to be more important with a web app where the web app actually has to be stood up. But if I basically say something like local host slash app1, that's going to suffice for a client inside there, a native client. Let's go ahead and choose OK. Now, once I have created this inside here, what we can see is that they have created a client ID for me. They've created the redirect URI. And so the final thing that I'm going to do inside here is under permissions to other applications. And once again, this is something that Visual Studio isn't able to do for you today. Hopefully soon they'll be updated to make this more transparent. But we're going to go ahead and add that inside here. And so now that I have the Office 365 permissions inside here, what I want to do is give myself a certain set of permissions. How many permissions do I want to give myself? While I'm doing my testing, I'll just give myself every single permission so that I am king of the universe. And once I have done that right here, now, actually, I'm not king of the universe because I'm giving myself delegated permissions. So I'm only really going to have permissions that the current user has. Let's go ahead and hit save right here. So now that I've hit save and I've created this application and I have different permissions inside, let's go back to the application. Let's go back to where I need to add in the name of the tenant, CPT classroom 2, and then the name of the domain is just the name of the tenant, and then on Microsoft.com. And then we need the client ID. So back here, I'm just going to take the client ID that was created for me inside there. Once I've got the client ID, we'll go ahead and paste that in. And then also we want to use this particular redirect URI inside there. Okay, so now that we have that, once again, this is just the code that you saw on the slides. So there's code that is going to acquire the token for the user, and it does that by interacting with the Active Directory Authentication Library, what we call ADAL, and we create an authentication context. We basically pass in the URL to the common sign-in point, and then there is a authentication context, acquire access token inside here, and we have various prompt behaviors. Now down here in the main application, since we have the Unified API client library, I can create a new GraphService object inside there. Now, one thing that's very important, when you create the new GraphService object, you want to point it to the host tenancy, which one again is graph.microsoft.com/beta my organization. So when you basically look at the resource, when you acquire the access token inside there, you basically point to graph.microsoft.com as the resource. But now when it's time to go ahead and actually connect, you have to basically put the endpoint where you're connecting to, which is going to be your tenancy inside here. Okay, let's go ahead and run this right here. And you can see that when I run it, the first thing is that it brings up a little browser. And this is a hardened browser to basically resist against attacks on a smart client. And it leads me through this log on process. And once we have logged on inside here, what we can see is that we can run things like client.me, execute async, get the result, bring it back, and basically put it inside here. So here we've printed out some information about Katie. We've also printed out information about all the different files and folders inside there. But now we've done hello world and we've started programming against the Unified API. In our next section, we're going to talk about managing authentication and access tokens. Once again, this is an essential topic if you're creating an MVC5 application and you want to access the Unified APIs, or really many other type of APIs where you have to manage access tokens. Okay, let's start with a little background on OAuth 2 and authentication flows. So Azure AD, that's the thing that's holding our application and our users. That's the thing we have to authenticate against and get access tokens. It supports several different types of authentication flows that are defined inside the OAuth 2 specification. Okay, now the idea of an authentication flow is it leads an application to obtaining an access token. And every time we obtain an access token, it's for a specific resource. Now, what was a pain before the Unified API is that Azure, Outlook, and SharePoint were 3 different resources. What's nice now is we have a single resource, so we only have to do the authentication flow one time to get each particular user an access token. Now, there are 3 different flows that are supported in Azure AD. There's the implicit grant flow that we use with native applications. The first example that I just did used that. There's the authorization code grant flow that we're going to look at next. And then there's also the client credentials grant flow. Let's talk about those in just a little bit more detail. So the implicit grant flow is something where the application makes a request to Azure AD. Azure AD then makes the user authenticate and then basically passes an access token back to the particular native application. Now, implicit grant flow can also be used by single-page applications that don't have any server-side code, but they're entirely client-side. But the idea is the application obtains an access token directly without needing to first acquire something called an authorization code. And that leads us to our second flow, authorization code grant flow. So this is commonly used in website applications that have server-side code. And the idea is that the application first obtains an authorization code by redirecting the user to a login page. The user logs in, and then Active Directory sends an authorization code back to your application by posting to a redirect page and including the authorization code as a query string parameter. The application is then able to take the authentication code, and together with what's called a secret password, it's then able to get the access token. Now, a big part of the authorization code grant flow is that the user puts in the password, which is only then posted to a Microsoft site. So the server-side code never gets a hold of the user's credentials. The user logs in, and all the application gets back is an authorization code. Now, there's one other flow that we're not going to be able to cover in this short session, which is client credentials grant flow. Client credentials grant flow is when an application needs to authenticate by itself without a user, because I want to do something such as take advantage of the app-only permissions that have been configured for my application. And if you've used S2S with on-prem and SharePoint app authentication, it's similar, because when you use client credential grant flow, you have to create a SSL certificate with a public-private key pair. The public key then has to be registered with Active Directory, and then you basically have to have the private key accessible to your application, which then is able to get the private key and send it when it authenticates. Okay, now the one that we're interested here is the authorization code grant flow. Now, we have a sample application that we're going to be using, and this application right here is the Unified API demo. This code is going to be available to everybody inside here. So what I'd like to do is just start up the application and see what it does at first. So I start the application, and note that there is no need for the user to authenticate when coming to this first page. There is a login button right here. The user can click to basically trigger the login. But to get to any of these pages, such as the tenant information or user information, the user is going to have to first authenticate. So how is all that going to be worked out? And that's what we're going to look at over the course of the next couple slides. Okay, so now the next thing we want to look at is the NuGet packages that are used in this demo. So if you have never used OWIN middleware that was introduced with MVC5, the time is now to get up to speed on what OWIN is and how we add OWIN middleware components. Okay, I'm going to give you a step through how to get up and going, but most people find that they need to kind of spend time cracking the books, or at least working directly with the concepts and programming techniques of working with OWIN. Okay, in addition to that, we're going to install the package for the entity framework, and then also for the Active Directory authentication library that we use in the first demo, and also the Office 365 Unified API client library, which the version I'm using is still in preview. Now, once we have a particular application that's set up, you have to have created the application and registered it with an Azure AD. And there's going to be a client ID, and there's also a password that's associated with that. Okay, if I go back here, and let's go ahead and look at this application that has already been set up for us right here. And what we can see is that when we have one of these web applications, well, now we're going to have a sign-on URL. Note that this, during development, will typically be localhost with some port number, but by the time you ship, this is going to be some real URL out on the internet, maybe up in Azure, where your application has been deployed. Okay, is it multi-tenant? Yes or no? Let's not worry about that in this talk. The client ID, we're going to need that, And then also with these MVC applications that use the authorization code flow, we're going to have one of these keys inside there. And the idea is you can create a new key, which is a public-private key pair. And once you've done that and you save it, you'll be able then, right after you save it, and this is a one-time only chance, is that you can now come and copy this to the clipboard inside there. So you have to basically get that key value, which becomes your secret key or your password. Note that there's also an important redirect URL down here. And then also down below, I've configured all of the Office 365 Unified API permissions like I showed in the previous demo. Okay, now once you have gotten those pieces in place right there, you also need the GUID for the hosting tenant that you see inside there. Now, once you have that, we are going to add a settings helper class. Just so in our C# code, we can quickly pull out the client ID, client secret, or the Azure AD tenant ID. And you can see that these first three are basically just pulling values out of the web.config file. We have another value for the Azure AD authority, which is login.windows.net. And then we have our tenant ID inside there. Now we need the Office Graph Resource ID, which is the exact same from the previous demo. And we have the Office Graph Service Endpoint, which is graph.microsoft.com/beta/organization. And then one other thing for some code is we have a claim type identifier object. Okay, so we can use the settings helper class to pull things back. Now, the next thing that we're going to see is that we need to cache security tokens, access tokens, for our particular users. And maybe in addition to access tokens, I might want to keep refresh tokens, because when you have a refresh token, once your access token expires, you can use the refresh token to get a new access token. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a special database, and we're going to use the entity framework. So notice that the very top class, I have app security context that inherits from DB context. Also, you can see that we have some code inside here that we call the base class, which is DB context, and we provide this particular name inside here. That becomes the name of the database that gets created. Now, when you want to create a entity framework database, which is automatically created, you basically add a DB set for each particular table. So here we've created a special class per user or per web user cache, and then we create a DB set on that. So what this is going to do is when our application starts up, it's automatically going to create this right here. I could extend the per web user cache with more fields if I wanted to, but we're going to not do that in this simple demo. Now, another thing we have to do is we have to create a custom token cache. And the reason for that is the Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL, provides you the ability to plug in your own token cache management system. And the way that you do that is you create a class that inherits from token cache. You add whatever custom logic that you want inside there, and then you're going to be able to pass this to the Active Directory Authentication Library. Now, in our case right here, what are the things that we need? We're going to create one of those databases that the entity framework is going to create. We're going to have a string for the user, which is going to keep a unique ID for the user. And then we have the per web cache. Now, we have a constructor here. And the idea is when someone creates one of these objects, they pass the unique string that identifies the user. And then we're going to hook up this set of methods, after access, before access. And so we're going to add logic into these two. One which basically is able to pull this blob out of the database and rehydrate our current user and the current user tokens. And then also, the first time we've created the user and gotten the token, we need to write it back into the database inside there. So that's what these actual implementations do. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do, let me go ahead and move over to the code sample here to step through this. So when you're using OWIN, one thing that we like to do is to put a startup.cs class. And here, notice that we have a class named startup, and then we add a attribute at the assembly level for OWIN Startup, and we point to our class right here. And the idea is when you do that, the OWIN framework will find your startup class and automatically call the configuration class and pass you an IApp builder. Now, you could have put all the logic here, but what gets to be a common practice now in the Microsoft circle is that we create a partial class here in this startup.cs, and then we create another file in app.start, which is startup.auth.cs, which fills out the other part of this particular startup class. And now we have the actual code for the configure auth method inside here. Okay, so with this, let me go ahead and now move back into my slides where it's a little bit easier to show. So what we're going to see is that when we do the OWIN Startup, we're going to call these components that we've added in through those NuGet packages that we added earlier. So set default sign in as authentication type. This basically just initializes the OAuth framework to basically say when I authenticate, go ahead and populate the ASP.NET security user object. Also, we'd like to use cookies to basically identify the user and keep a handle on which users are which as we go from request to request. And now here's the real kicker right here. There is a piece of OWIN middleware to automate many aspects of authenticating when we use OpenID Connect authentication. So we do things like pass the client ID, we pass the authority, then we set up notifications. What notifications do we want? Well, we want the authorization code received notification, and I'm going to show you that code on the next slide. And also we do things like set up error handling if authentication fails. Now, what happens is that, let's go back to our application right here. Let's go ahead and start our application. And let's go ahead and set a breakpoint here when the authorization code is received, so we can see exactly when that happens. Okay, so what's going to happen at this point is a user is going to click login. And as we log in right here, the user then will be prompted, and I've already logged in enough where it's kind of going past the login screen. But now what we see is that the user has basically put credentials in, clicked sign in, that's been successful. And so now Azure AD has basically posted back to our redirect accept page and basically passed the authorization code. So one of the things that we can see inside here is if I go ahead and choose add watch and we look at the context, well, there's my authorization code. I also have this neat thing which is called the authorization ticket inside there. So what we're going to do in this case right here is we're going to create a client credential. We're now going to use the ticket, and we're going to basically say find the user associated with this ticket. Now we're going to go ahead and create one of the authentication, one of our token cache objects, and note that we have a user ID already. That user ID doesn't make sense to a human, but it makes a lot of sense in Active Directory to identify different users. Okay, now that we've got that working, the next piece that we're going to have right here is to basically get the authorization context. Now, once we've got the authorization context, we're going to say acquire token by authorization code. And now that's going to be stored inside there. Now, this last piece right here is optional. I just wanted to do a couple examples where I also do direct REST calls. So I'm just going to take the access token and expose it in a session object. Once again, this is just kind of demoware right here. Typically, the code I've had before up to this line is really all that you need. Let's go ahead, choose finish, and now this particular user is logged in. So now the user is logged in. Okay, let's go ahead and move back to our slides right here. What we're going to see is that to basically augment the OWIN middleware code for OpenID Connect, we need to add a special class, a controller class, to our particular project, and it has to have a name account controller, because the OWIN middleware basically will post back to things like account/sign-in. So you create an account controller and you implement some well-known method names: sign in, sign out, consent app, admin consent app, and refresh. Now, here's an example of what sign-in looks like. Notice that there is this thing that we get passed where I can say HTTP get OWIN context and authentication, and I get back this special object of type Authentication Manager. Now, once I have the Authentication Manager, I can say Authentication Manager.challenge, and that will actually drive the login process, making the user log in. Now, there's also sign out code and refresh session code. I'm not going to spend much time going through that. But also note that there are these two different methods inside your controller class: consent app and consent admin app. And the idea is that they will redirect to these. And the idea is you're supposed to put together a string that calls to the OAuth2 authorization endpoint and passes in information to basically bring up a screen for the user to consent to. Okay, now the last piece that we have right here is creating one of these GraphService objects. So here's typical code down here where I basically figure out who the user is. One of the nice things about the OWIN middleware is it populates the current claims principal object. So I can say claims principal.current, find first, name identifier, and I figure out basically who the signed in user is. Well, next thing I need is that object identifier for the current user. And so I get that through the claims as well. And then finally, as part of the Active Directory authentication library, I can create this special user identifier object. Next, I create a client credential object, and that's with the client ID and the client secret. And then I create a new authentication context. And when I create this authentication context, I'm going to point to basically Azure AD authority, and then I'm going to create one of those new particular token cache objects with the particular user. Now, note that when you call the authentication context constructor, one of the options that you have for that second parameter is to pass a value of null, which says I don't want to use a custom token cache manager. But when you pass in one of these token cache derived objects, like we're doing here with the new EFADAL token cache object, we're basically passing a custom token cache mechanism into the Active Directory authentication library. Well, now I basically call new on GraphService. The first parameter is going to be the Office GraphService endpoint. And then the second parameter is basically this anonymous function inside here, which basically acquires a access token within a call to acquire token silent. And once you have a custom token cache manager inside there, if there's an access token, it hands it back to you. If there is an access token that's expired, but there's a refresh token, it automatically does the round trip and gets it back for you. So the authentication, the Active Directory authentication library is doing a tremendous amount of work for you behind the scenes. Okay, well, finally, you have the tenant controller class inside here, which now that we have this factory method that can create the graph service object for us, I just call graph service factory dot get graph service. My controller can then do something like call client details. And basically, once we get this particular method inside there, I'm going to call execute async. Note that I want to basically pause synchronously for the response to come back. So we're going to use the await keyword. And then we'll just basically take this and pass this off to our view. And here's just an example of a view that I have with various things inside there. Okay, well now let's finish up by just exploring some of the programming possibilities we have when using the Unified API, and particularly using the client library. So back inside of our application, once again, I'm going to go ahead and just start the application here. And note that I have Fiddler running here in the back end. And if I now go and I do some type of a login attempt, or note that instead of going through login, let me also point out that if I have something, such as our tenant controller, and I have the authorized attribute in place, and then a particular user decides, not to go through the login route, but simply to click one of these links and go to that controller is going to trigger the login sequence. Now here I've got things working. So Katie J has put in her password, saved it. So as a developer, I don't want to keep going through the login screen. So I can basically cache those details. But now you can see that the user has been authenticated, the access token has been taken back, and now we can basically start calling inside here. And in the last coding example, in the previous section, you kind of saw that I could get the tenant details. I could pass them off to the particular view for the tenant. And basically that gives us this particular screen right here. Well, let's say I wanted to get at users, or I wanted to get at groups, or if I wanted to get at information about the current user. Well, that's great. Well, how about if I wanted to jump over into Outlook and look at this particular user's mail messages that have been sent? Maybe I want to look at SharePoint data and look at a particular user's files. So what you can see in this demo, and I've kind of created it so you can play around with it and kind of get comfortable with things, that if you want to do something such as access the current users collection, well, you're able to call client.users execute async. When the result comes back, notice that here we have this user result. Note that a lot of the unified API, the results come back in a page-based result metaphor. So here I'm getting the current page. Now, to really do this correct, after you get what's in the current page, you have to look at the user result and see if more pages are available. Here, to keep things simple, let's just kind of show you that when you go to a page, we can also specify, let's go ahead and look at the usage data inside or have some type of a where clause. And now I'm going to build a collection of user info objects and basically use that to basically populate a particular view inside there. So you see that the razor view is actually really simple to get this effect right here. Now, let's say that I wanted to get to mail. Here's an example where we want to get to a particular mail message. Also note that as I'm using Fiddler here, as you're exploring around, make sure that I go here, I go ahead and I click on mail, bring up the mail messages inside there. Now let's kind of go back here and see that I've added a filter, time date received. And now when we get the response back, you're going to see that it's just basically a JSON response with mail messages. Same thing with files. If I go ahead and I take a look at the files controller, here we're basically saying client.me.files. Note that there is a query object that we have to give us more flexibility of exactly what we're looking for inside there. But I'm able to look at everything with the exact same type of approach where I have client.me.files.messages.events. So it just provides a very easy metaphor for programming. Okay, just to wrap up, we covered a lot of stuff there. So if you're moving from being a typical SharePoint server-side developer over to this new world of Office API programming, what are the learning curves you have to go through? Well, working with Azure AD applications, getting comfortable with the management portal in Azure, understanding OAuth authentication flows, using the connected services wizard that will hopefully soon be updated for the unified APIs, and developing MVC5 apps, understanding controllers and views, but also understanding the OWIN framework and the Microsoft implementation, which is known as Catania. Being able to work with the Active Directory authentication library and the entity framework are all different skills that most programmers should get up to speed on. Okay, now just to point out a couple different resources that you have at your disposal, dev.office.com is your main go-to URL at Microsoft to get this kind of information. I showed you the API Explorer at graphexplorer2.azurewebsites.com. A couple other things to call out. There's some great labs that Jeremy Thake and his team at Microsoft has created, along with people like me and Scott Hillier and Andrew Connell. Speaking of my friend Andrew Connell, he has a great course up on Pluralsight, Office 365 APIs, Overview, Authentication, and Discovery Service. That's a great thing to do, and you won't believe it, but I'll also mention that we have a training course at Critical Path Training called the Great Office 365 Adventure. It is the son of the Great SharePoint Adventure, and that really delves into a deep dive, 5 days of training with all these new different skills that we need. So wrapping up, what did we cover? We basically covered working with the Office 365 Unified API. This little graphic on the slide right here is something that someone at Microsoft came up with just to kind of show that with this one particular API, who knows where we'll be able to get to. The potential is unlimited.